Mm.
I'm sorry, I can't help myself. I see all these people I know. Hi, Brennan. How's South Australia treating you? And the Space Museum down there. It's so good to see your name on the list. And a whole lot of other people. Adam from Macquarie University, someone you might know, Richard.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah. Dimitri. It's all the guides from Sydney Observatory, Duane. Hey.
Brennan there. Dimitri, yeah.
Yeah.
I see some people from my astronomy class have joined. That's great.
I love this. It's like catching up with old friends.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, terrific to have you all joining us this evening. I think the number of attendees is kind of plateauing. So yeah, and we're just after 6. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this ADSA Australasian Dark Sky Alliance webinar. I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking to you from today. And I'm coming to you from Darug lands of the Wadawurrung people here in the north of Sydney. It is a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Associate Professor Duane Hamacher. So Duane is Associate Professor of Cultural Astronomy at the University of Melbourne and has held many positions in the field of cultural astronomy and its related areas, and is really an expert in this area worldwide, and we're very lucky to have him in Australia. And so without further ado, I will just mention that we'll have some extra elements at the end of the Q&A session tonight. So I do encourage you to hang around for the question and answer session with Duane. As usual, please put your questions into the Q&A box that you should have in your Zoom interface. And we'll try to get through as many of those as we can after Duane's talk. And then if you hang around a little bit, then we've got a special video on the wonders of the night sky and I guess why we're also interested in protecting that from the effects of light pollution. But yes, without further ado, I will hand over to Duane, who's going to share some slides with us and give us a wonderful talk on protecting the night sky heritage from light pollution. So Duane, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure, after a year and a half, we should have this worked out by now, but something always happens, right? You seeing the proper view yet?
I think we're seeing the presenter view.
How are we now?
That's perfect.
Excellent. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate both of you inviting me, Richard and Marty, to come speak today. And I want to thank everybody for coming and joining me. It's been a beautiful, gorgeous day here in what has been otherwise dark, gloomy Melbourne. And this is our second to last day of kind of freedom. So our spirits are up a bit. And I'm very excited to come and speak to you about some of the exciting work that we've been doing in this space and to pose some sort of challenging ideas that I think that would be of interest to everybody. I'm speaking from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm very excited to be working with Bunurong, Wurundjeri, Taungurung elders and communities to work on ways of documenting and sharing their star knowledge and to look at ways that we can help to safeguard that knowledge from the erasure of light pollution, which incidentally is the name of this talk. So I'm going to pose a pretty significant and pretty powerful question right at the very beginning. And then I hope that throughout the talk, I can show you and demonstrate that this is a real serious problem. I think we all know it is from our different perspectives on light pollution, particularly relating to astronomy. But what I want to focus on today is how this is actually cultural heritage. It's shared cultural heritage with everybody. But I'm going to focus on the long ancient history of this cultural heritage here in Australia. And the question I'm going to pose, incidentally, is pretty much the same title of a paper that I have co-authored with Crystal Dinopoli and Bon Mott. So Crystal Dinopoli is a Gamilaroi woman who is now an honors student at Monash, who finished her undergrad degree, graduated this year in astrophysics, and now is doing honors degree in astrophysics at Monash. And today was announced that she is also one of the winners of the 30 Under 30 award out in Australia. And Bon Mott is a PhD candidate here at the University of Melbourne in visual art, who's looking at philosophical ideas about Indigenous knowledge, gender identity, and science through performance art. And we wrote a paper with this pretty strong title called "Is Light Pollution a Form of Cultural Genocide?" Actually, we didn't put a question mark. We said that it is. We said light pollution as a form of cultural genocide. Wow, cultural genocide, that's pretty hardcore. What are we talking about here? What do we really mean? The American Genocide Museum describes cultural genocide as the acts and measures undertaken to destroy a nation or ethnic group's culture through spiritual, national, and cultural destruction. It's a pretty bold statement, and I could certainly see how people might, feel a little bit uncomfortable with the term genocide being used, because it has a lot of implications, because there's a difference between people and ethnicity. But the point of this is that star knowledge is cultural heritage, and it's not just cultural heritage that's nice and we like to be able to see the stars, but something that is necessary, something that is required. It's something you really need. And the colonization of Australia and cultures, other places around the world really reflect this in really horrific ways, that light pollution is a form of colonization. And that's what we're going to learn about a bit today. So let's look at this map. This is a map that shows globally recognized Indigenous cultures of the world. Now, what I mean by globally recognized, I mean state or national recognition. So if you look here, all those little colored dots, those are areas, places where even the state or government recognizes the Indigenous people of those areas. Areas where you see white is just where there's no, the state or government doesn't recognize it at all. You find that in parts of Africa, you find that in parts of the Middle East and across much of Asia and Europe. Now, there are Indigenous cultures in those parts of the world, of course. Russia, you look at the Evenki people, or the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, the Basque people of what is northern Spain, the far southern tip of France. You've got places like that around the world. But these are the ones that are recognized, formally documented and recognized by the states, which reflects a whole other issue altogether. But what I want to get across in this is to show you how the idea of colonization and urban expansion correlates to these areas. So if you look at urban expansion, we see this reflected in light pollution, right? We see this mostly as cities, but in parts of Australia in particular, these areas down in Western Australia, that's mining and natural resource extraction. But you can see a correlation, a very strange correlation between the concentrations of Indigenous cultures that are recognized by their own countries and states and light pollution. So you look in the northern part of Canada, the Northern Dene, Inuit communities, lots of recognized communities across there. You see very little or almost no light pollution whatsoever. Same with Alaska. You look at continental US, look at the areas where you see those clusters of recognized Indigenous groups, and then look at the map of the US. Those don't seem to correspond well with the areas of massive light pollution. Look down at the Baja Peninsula of Mexico, where you see a bit of blue. Look at South America, across the across the Amazon basin into the Andes. See high concentrations, but again, that doesn't correlate to where all the light pollution is. You look at Australia, along the coast, most of the concentration is the central and western and northern parts of Australia. Again, you look at the map of light pollution. So what I'm trying to do by juxtaposing these two images is to show you that what we see as light pollution, the urban expansion, is directly correlated to colonization. And that is where things come into play with this discussion about cultural heritage, the erasure of cultural heritage being a form of cultural genocide. So we all know that all of us need the sky. The sky is shared heritage, it's shared culture by everywhere, every culture, every people in the world. But not everybody appreciates it the same. Not everybody applies it the same. Modern Western society, we spend all of our time looking at these damn things. We're inundated by screens. We don't even look up. We can't see the lights from the cities anymore, or we can't see the stars from the lights in the city anymore. We've really cut ourselves off from that in so many ways. But if you look at traditional cultures, that isn't the case. So we can argue that we all need this connection to the sky. The sky has always been a focal point of cultures around the world. It's always served as an anchor point of knowledge. It served as a memory space where we encode knowledge into the stars. You can learn more about that with books like The Memory Code by Lynn Kelly and Memory Craft, which show how we as humans have evolved over 200,000 plus years to link memory to place. And the stars are one of those anchor points of that. We observe the stars to know when the seasons are changing, to understand the behavior of the plants and animals, to be able to forecast the weather. All those elements we've always had and we've always used. But the urbanization, the colonization, those things have worked to erase that. And for many people, you can't even see the stars. I'm reminded of a time about 10 years ago, I went to Singapore and I gave a talk to a private college there to students in a science class. And there were a lot of students interested in physics, but when I asked about astronomy, the students kind of looked at each other like, are you kidding? Like, no, nobody was interested. And I asked why, and none of them could connect to it. And if you stand outside almost anywhere in Singapore, you can't see anything in the sky. You can see the sun, the moon, and maybe you can see Venus or Jupiter. That's it. You're not going to see anything else. Light pollution is terrible. And most major cities have that same problem. Like I said, if you look at a place like Australia, we've got a shared heritage, for better, for worse. We can see that the colonization of Australia was really driven by astronomy itself. It was driven by this idea to expand and colonize the remaining part of the world, to find the Great Southland, to go to what became known today as Australia. And what is the major anchor point that we all know of in Australia in particular? It's the Southern Cross. For better and for worse, this has become the most iconic symbol in Australia and is very iconic to lots of cultures around the world, particularly across the Southern Hemisphere. It's on several national flags: Australia, New Zealand, Brazil. But we're losing our ability to even see these stars in the Southern Cross. For those who might be interested, there's a fantastic film that came out a few years ago called We Don't Need a Map by Warwick Thornton, an Aboriginal filmmaker. And his focus of that film was talking about the Southern Cross as a symbol in the sky that was co-opted by all the wrong people for all the wrong ways in Australia, but wanted to go back and show the ancient history of this constellation as a symbol and its application and meaning throughout Australia. So if you haven't seen it before, I highly encourage. Again, it's called We Don't Need a Map. So, in Australia, this has been called the Southern Cross because it was one of the most recognizable, distinguishable constellations that the colonial forces saw when they went down to the Southern Hemisphere. There's many different views of the Southern Cross and what it means all across Australia. In the southeastern part of the country, it commonly seen as a yarran tree, a top star, that ruddy kind of star, In this part of Victoria was seen as bunya, a possum that ran to the top of a tree. It's actually a hunter who was chasing a giant emu, ran to the top of the tree, and the ancestors turned him into a possum for being such a coward. It's also that color of the star reflected as the color of the possum itself. So one thing I want to jump in and say, all the elders that we've worked with over the years all say the same thing. Everything on the land is reflected in the sky. So everything you want to know about the country around you, the plants, the animals, the landscape, culture, everything, it's all reflected in the sky. The sky is a map. It's a law book. It's a text. It's a memory space. It is everything. So anything on the land is going to be reflected in the sky. And because the stars move in predictable ways, year after year, month after month, sometimes more complex than others. The stars kind of come around to the same point in the sky every year, but the sun has its own complicated movements going back and forth across the horizon. The moon goes through its phases. Sometimes it's sort of tilted in different ways throughout the year. The planets have their own complex motions. It can get very complicated, but it's very predictable. It's an anchor point in the sky, and you can utilize that to tell the changing seasons, to predict weather, to know the links between the planets and the animals, things we're going to talk about today. The second thing that all the elders say is your ability to make sense of all that is reflected in your ability to read the stars. And by reading the stars, what the elders mean is your ability to observe, understand, and interpret the changing positions and properties of the stars. So it's not just the positions of the stars, but the properties. Things like stars changing brightness over time or twinkling, the colors of the stars changing. The colors are all important. So all of those elements are essential into knowing how to apply that knowledge that has been passed down for thousands of years. It's been evolving and changing as the sky and the landscape changes and evolves. So, in Australia, different cultures might see the Southern Cross as a stingray, and the two pointers are two sharks chasing that stingray. In other parts, it's two fishermen chasing the stingray. But you got lots of diverse views of these constellations and these stars. But the important thing isn't just that you've got nice views of it, it's all knowledge. It's all important. It's all knowledge about the survival of the people and the cultures. Now, there's something special about the Southern Cross that you may or may not be familiar with. The International Astronomical Union, of which I'm a member, is the global society for professional astronomers. And one of the many things they're tasked with is formally naming everything in the cosmos, everything in the sky, whether it's stars, planets, asteroids, comets, features on other planets, whatever. They've got different working groups that go through, and their job is to formalize the names of those different things. So I'm in the working group for star names, which started off with only about 5 or 6 of us, and now we've got about 20. But we've gone through and we've been formalizing the names of stars in the sky. So if you go in the scientific literature, each of those stars, instead of being known by their Bayer designation, which is that Latinized, it's a letter of the Greek alphabet and the Latinized version of the constellation name. Southern Cross here, for example, the bottom star is Alpha Crucis. You go clockwise from the bottom, Alpha Crucis, Beta Crucis, Gamma Crucis, Delta Crucis, and Epsilon Crucis. Those are the 5 stars. We've been going through and formalizing different names from around the world. The 5th star, Epsilon Crucis, is now known globally as Guinan. This is a Wadman Aboriginal name that was provided by Uncle Bill Edom-Damaharney. He's a senior Wadman elder who I believe is in his 90s now, and he's still kicking on. That is known globally as Guinan, and that is a dilly bag filled with songs of knowledge. It was quite an interesting situation a few years ago when we had this name formally recognized. There were quite a few people with maybe tattoos for not quite the right reasons who would have been pretty surprised to know they now have a globally recognized Aboriginal star tattooed on their person. But the reason I bring this up is that, even as a symbol that many people across Australia can link to, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, From the cities, you can't even see some of these stars now. It's become that bad. Guinan's pretty much wiped out. Even Delta Crucis, which is now Imai, which is a Mercy name. You can't hardly see those from the city anymore. And this light pollution is becoming that much of a problem that we can't even see this constellation that we all so closely recognize and link to. Now, you might be wondering, well, okay, if astronomy is an important topic within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures of Australia, well, do they have astronomers? Good question. The answer is yes, they absolutely do. In many of the cultures across the country, remembering that Australia has 300 plus different distinct Aboriginal groups with their own language, culture, and traditions, and of course the Torres Strait Islands between Cape York and Papua New Guinea. Many of these cultures have specialized people within the community whose job it is to observe the stars every night. In the Torres Strait, in the Western Torres Strait, this is called Zugabul Mabaig. This literally translates to star person or star man. This is a lino cut by David Boson, which I got sitting right here in my office. We're going to be putting up in the physics building soon. This is showing how this person, their job was to keep track of the stars night by night throughout the entire year. And they pass that knowledge on through a warp. A warp is this hourglass-shaped drum. And in song and dance are one of the main media through which this knowledge is passed down. And the Zugabul Mabaig were such proficient astronomers that they have an entire ceremony dedicated to lunar eclipses. And it was the Zugabul Mabaig's job in preparation for these very rare and very important ceremonies to let people know in advance when the lunar eclipse is going to occur. So this is something to think about, that, you know, eclipse prediction is a part of this. You know, there's a tremendous scientific layer of this knowledge that just doesn't get recognized in general. And I'm going to be shameless right here and plug it. I've been writing a book with David Boson and 5 other elders called The First Astronomers. It's going to come out in March of next year. And it's all about the scientific layers of indigenous star knowledge in Australia and around the world. So look for that through Allen and Unwin Press. It'll be a trade book, so it's going to be easily accessible to everybody. And even though it is largely based on research we've been doing for the last 10 years, there's going to be brand new stuff in that book that's never been published before. Even as I was completing writing the book with the elders, they were sharing knowledge I was putting in at the very last minute that completely revolutionizes some areas of cultural astronomy. But back to dark skies. In the Torres Strait, one of the most recognizable constellations, one of the most important and prominent constellations, is that of Tagai. And Tagai was regarded as a great spiritual man, a fierce warrior, an expert fisherman, and he commanded a crew. His first mate was Kareg, and he commanded a crew of 12 men called Zugabuls. And the elders teach that long ago, they all went on an expedition onto the reefs that was supposed to last for a couple of days. And they weren't having much luck catching anything. So as Tagai was trying to pay attention to find a more appropriate place that they would have success, the day grew hot and the men grew tired and began consuming all the rations. And Tagai realized what happened, and he flew into a fit of rage because they consumed all the rations for the entire trip in just a few hours. And he killed the 12 Zugabuls. He bound them into 2 groups of 6 and speared them, and they went into the ocean. But because they're spiritual beings and couldn't actually physically die, they ascended into the sky as 2 groups of stars, Usium and Seg. We know those stars today in Western astronomy as the Pleiades and the belt and scabbard stars of Orion. Tagai himself and Kareg, his first mate, went to the opposite side of the sky because he wanted to be as far away from the Zugabuls as possible because he was that pissed off at them. He went to the opposite side of the sky where he has an enormous constellation. His left hand is the Southern Cross. His right hand is the constellation Corvus the Crow. And his arms, hand, body, head, torso, legs are traced out by the stars in Lupus and Centaurus. He stands in his canoe, which is the constellation Scorpius, and Kareg is the star Antares. Tagai stands at the front of the canoe, and Kareg sits at the back, paddling through the cosmos. As these stars rise and set throughout the year, they inform people about the changing seasons, when the dugong are going to be migrating, when the turtle are laying their eggs, when the sagar transitions to the nege, which transitions to the cookie, the wet monsoon season. As these constellations dive into the ocean at sunset or sunrise, it signifies splashing up water, which falls as the seasonal rains throughout the year. So these stars are critically important, but because of the effects of light pollution, they're being slowly erased. And this group of stars is so important that the entire education school system in the Torres Strait goes by the name of Tagai State College. It's really important. It's the major anchor point for the Torres Strait Islanders and their connection to the stars. And this information has been shared with me by a number of elders, including Uncle Allo Toplin, Sigar Passy, Ron Day, artists like David Bozen and Tommy Powell, other elders like Elsa Day. It's a whole crew of elders who were very excited to be sharing this traditional star knowledge. And it helps us understand it. But we have to recognize that even places as remote and far away as the Torres Strait, light pollution is becoming a problem. We can look at this amazing artwork by Tommy Powell that talks about the Psi. And the Psi is a particular part of the sky that appears before Maima, which I'll talk about next. These two parts of the sky tell islanders in the eastern part of the Torres Strait the Tagai is going to appear soon, and they need to begin preparing for ceremonial grounds associated with the anointing of Tagai. So again, there's all this ceremony and culture tied with this. So the appearance of Tagai, the appearance of the Psi, these other constellations, tell the people when to plant, tell them when to fish, when to harvest, when to navigate, all these things that are essential for survival, cultural and physical. Now, that's actually the Carina Nebula. And we all are familiar, for those of you who are familiar with astronomy, all the amateur observers, the Carina Nebula is a beautiful nebula between the Southern Cross and the False Cross. The False Cross is Maima. And that's seen just before the Southern Cross appears. And they know that it's not the Southern Cross because those stars are not as bright as the Southern Cross and they're spread out a bit further. It also tells people about the approaching of Tagai and preparing for ceremonies. So as you can see, there's different constellations of stars with varying degrees, with stars of varying degrees of magnitude and brightness. So those are some connect the dots constellations of the brighter stars. But as many of us already know, we've got this beautiful view of the Milky Way from the southern hemisphere because the southern celestial pole of the Earth is tilted towards the center of the galaxy. And what this means is that we've got all these beautiful views of the dark spaces in the Milky Way itself. And these dark spaces in the Milky Way trace out a whole slew of different figures that are important to different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups. For example, in the middle part here, I'm not sure if you can see it with my cursor, in Gamilaroi country, there's a kangaroo there. In Uwalyi country, there's also two crocodiles. But the most famous, arguably, is that of the celestial emu. And this is one of those constellations that are found all across Australia. The exact shape of the emu varies a little bit in the sky, but universally, the head is the coal sack, and the neck is that sort of dark spaces in the Milky Way going to the galactic bulge, where we see Scorpius and Sagittarius. And different Aboriginal communities see that sort of end of the emu, its legs down towards Sagittarius. Bit variable, changes a bit with different cultures and different times of the year. And you have a broad variety of oral traditions that talk about how the emu got into the sky and why it's there. But the foundational knowledge, that core knowledge about what it means and what it tells you, that scientific layer of knowledge, is almost universally the same because it ties in with the behavior of the emu throughout the year. So as an example, let's go to Uwalyi country. So the Uwalyi Nation is a community, it's sort of a dialect of the Gamilaroi language in the very northern end of central New South Wales and the far southern bit of Queensland, so up near Lightning Ridge, up into Deer and Bandy. And this is work that was done by Dr. Robert Fuller when he was doing his Master of Philosophy at Macquarie University, working with Gamilaroi and Uwalya elders, primarily Uncle Gillar Michael Anderson, who's there on the left. Uncle Gillar is one of the authors of the book that I'm writing. And he shared with Bob a tremendous degree of traditional knowledge about Gamilaroi and Uwalya astronomy, which they published together in various journal publications. They even made a documentary called Star Stories of the Dreaming and an education curriculum for students across New South Wales, particularly in those communities. And what Uncle Gillar and other elders taught Bob and the rest of us is that the emu in the sky has a different meaning depending on the time of the year and the time of the night. It's not always the same thing. Now, even though those stars may not be moving relative to each other in the sky, its meaning and its significance changes. And that correlates to the behavior of the emu in the changing seasons. So what all these panels here are doing is showing you the emu just after sunset. So after the sun is set and the emus come out when it's dark enough that we can see it, of course, around April, May, just after sunset, the full emu is above the horizon. And this is seen as a female emu, and she's running. The reason she's running is it's the females who run and chase the males to mate. They chase the males and they mate. They can lay a few different clutches of eggs in a breeding season. And in that breeding season, each clutch can range 15 eggs, 10 to 15 eggs. And those eggs are about the size of about anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen chicken eggs. They're quite large. So when they nest, the female lays the eggs and then she leaves. It's the male's responsibility to sit on the nest and incubate the eggs. The reason for that is simply because the amount of energy required for the female to produce all of those eggs is too great for her to also sit on them for the remainder of time for the next 2 months. The incubation period's about 60 days. And during that time, the emus don't move at all. That's what we see in June and July. So April and May, the emus are running, the female emus are running. That's the time to go collect emu eggs. And there's a really great TEDx talk by Kirsten Banks, a graduate woman who's studying astrophysics at UNSW. There's a TikTok sensation with, I think, pushing 300,000 followers on TikTok. She gave a great talk a couple years ago for TEDx and focused a bit on the techniques for how Aboriginal people would hunt these emu eggs. So we go into June and July, and it's no longer seen as a female emu running. It's now seen as the male sitting on the nest. And when the male sits on the nest, he doesn't get up and go anywhere for that entire time. He doesn't eat, doesn't drink, doesn't do anything except get up and turn the eggs about a dozen times a day. He only leaves the nest if he has to protect it from predators. And as the Milky Way swings around, come August and September, it's now seen as a male getting up off of the nest. The reason he's getting up off of the nest, the chicks are hatching. And it's his responsibility to look after the young and to rear the young. And a little bit later on, as the Milky Way continues swinging around, even though now it might look like it's the emu lying on its back, the others say, well, this is the time of the year when the emus are actually sitting in the water holes. When they sit in the water holes, it's like a celestial Archimedes. They displace the water, which falls as the seasonal rain that picks up at that time of the year. So they say the image, that silhouette, now looks like the rump of the emu on the horizon, and it's sitting in those water holes. And when you look at rainfall in places like Lightning Ridge, you see this huge spike in rainfall that peaks in October and November. And then come December and January, the emus are really low below the horizon. Doesn't come out again until really March and picks back up in April and May. But what all of this means is that this symbolism of the emu in the sky, how you see it, how you connect to that with what the elders teach us, is that it informs the changing seasons. When we go from what we think of in Western society as spring, autumn, winter, fall, it also informs the behavior of the emu itself, the food economics, how that's tied in, weather at those times of the year. All of those things are anchored in the emu. There's a lot more to it beyond this. We've only just scratched the surface of this, but Those are the deeper layers of knowledge that usually have various restrictions. If you want to learn more about this, Bob and Uncle Gillar and others published a series of papers on this, and I'll show you where you can find those a bit later on. It also links to ceremony. So if you look here at section C, at frame C, you see that Milky Way is kind of perpendicular to the horizon. And that's when the emu is getting up off the nest. That's also the time of year that Boris ceremonies were held. I'm not going to go into any detail about Boris ceremonies because a lot of that information is considered secret. But the public information about it is it's usually two large circles, two large ceremonial grounds connected by a pathway. And that ceremonial ground is actually aligned to the southwest part of the sky. It's seen as a reflection of the emu in the sky. It's the same part of the sky as the emu itself. And this was an initiation. This is the time of the year that men bring the boys into manhood, the same as the male emus rearing the young and bringing them into adulthood, as it were. That same part of the sky is seen as something else in the Torres Strait. They have what they call Kagasu Usul. And Kagasu Usul is the shovel-nosed ray. Shovel-nosed ray is Kaigas. Kagasu refers to Kaigas in the sky. That ul at the end refers to a celestial counterpart. And Usul is a reference to dirty water. So what this ray, they call it a shovel-nosed shark colloquially, but it's technically a ray. They're bottom feeders. They go and scour the bottom of the water and kick up a lot of dust and silt. And when you see Kagasu Usul in the sky, we see it as the Milky Way. So the Milky Way, which is called P, is the whole thing, but that Kaigas going through in the water is seen reflected in the sky as this part of the Milky Way. So you see that dirty water being kicked up. That's all the light dust you see, all those stars and nebula in the Milky Way. But Kagasu Usu isn't just something neat to see. It actually informs the people about important things. It's used to travel. It's used to navigate because it tells you about ocean currents. So when the head of Kaigas is looking towards the east, they know the currents are going to be running west. And when the head is tilted towards the southwest and the tail's in the north, and the currents are going to be running to the east. So it's about the orientation and position of this Kaigasu Usul, of this shovel-nosed ray in the sky that informs people about navigation. So again, this isn't just something neat to see in the sky. It's important. It's critically essential for telling people how to navigate, how to move around. Another important astronomical phenomenon that isn't a star and isn't the Milky Way or the dark spaces between the stars, but is equally important, is something that I've actually only seen, for me, noticed it when I was in the Torres Strait, and that is zodiacal light. So zodiacal light in terms of Western science is interplanetary dust in the plane of the solar system that's reflected by the sun. So you're always going to see that zodiacal light. When it's close to the sun, you're going to see it at dusk and dawn. You're not really going to see it in the middle of the night. You can see Gegenschein, that's something else altogether. But this sort of arch, this kind of long, thin pyramid of light that goes up into the sky is a reflection of that gas and dust in the plane of the solar system. And different cultures of the world see zodiacal light in different ways. In the Torres Strait, Uncle Medi Kaige is an elder. He taught me that at the end of the year, around November, so during the Nege, just before the cookie season, the monsoon season comes, you're going to see that arch of light. He didn't refer to it as zodiacal light, but he talked about this really thin triangle arch of light that extends directly up into the sky and almost reaches zenith, reaches the very top part of the sky. When you see that, you know it's time to prepare. You've got a few weeks before the first rains of the monsoon begin falling. And when he told me that, I initially didn't quite realize what he meant. And then I realized he was talking about zodiacal light. And incidentally, that time of the year is when it's easier to see the zodiacal light, because the zodiacal light follows the path of the ecliptic in the sky. So when it's tilted off at the side, it's not always straight up in the sky. Sometimes it's tilted off at the side. But at sunset, just after sunset, when the zodiacal light is noticeable, and having been on Mare up in the Torres Strait, it's very distinct. It's beautiful to see. That's an important element. So if you're not, again, there's a lot more knowledge behind that than just it pointing up in the sky. But these are types of astronomical phenomena that you're not going to see anything like this in any kind of area where you've got light pollution of almost any kind. I've been out in Siding Spring, you might be able to see something like this, but even the light pollution from coal seam gas in the Pilliga and the distant lights of Brisbane and Sydney are becoming problems, even though that's a dark sky reserve. It's protected. These are all things that are essential to survival. They're essential to navigation. They're essential to, life and well-being and culture that are disappearing or being erased. For those of us in the southern parts of Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, other parts of the world, the southern hemisphere, you can see the aurora. It might surprise people to know there are actually Aboriginal traditions of the aurora from Uluru in southeast Queensland. It's surprisingly, those traditions go surprisingly far north, you might not realize. But the aurora has special significance too. In Sydney, the aurora help inform a Mudong cycle that goes by about every 11.5 years. And it's this longer term seasonal cycle that's linked to the appearance of aurora. This is from the Darawal people of southern Sydney. And across, Victoria, South Australia, Tassie, southern part of WA, you've got lots of different traditions about the aurora. And in fact, out in Gunai country in Gippsland in Victoria, there are traditions that talk about how a spirit ancestor put his son in charge of men's initiation and wasn't supposed to share the knowledge about that, but it got leaked and women found out about it and they weren't supposed to know about that. He became very angry and created this brilliant aurora that filled the entire sky. A massive tsunami came in from the ocean and killed people. People started losing their minds and turning on each other. Chaos ensued. It was this huge natural disaster. But later on, things died down. The spirit ancestor's son agreed that it would be taboo for anybody else to know about it, but it serves as a warning that anytime you see the aurora in the sky, it's a warning to obey traditional law and follow those traditional rules and not break taboos. So the appearance of the red aurora serves as a warning that if you break those rules again, this massive destructive catastrophe is going to come again. So these are things that reinforce the culture, that reinforce the scientific information within the oral traditions, that reinforce the social laws. So if you are pushing that out through light pollution, you're literally erasing everything. And one more thing I want to bring up, because I'm doing pretty good on time, is I want to bring up something else that is really important. That's the scintillation, the twinkling of stars. So we all know that, the stars twinkle, it's poetry, lullabies, everything. For those of us who are astrophysicists, twinkling stars are a problem. They're not something you want. They, really inhibit our ability to collect accurate and precise observations of the stars, galaxies. We go to great lengths at great cost to try to get rid of all the effects of scintillation. Putting telescopes in space like Hubble, we put them on the tops of mountains, try to get away from, the heaviest part of the atmosphere to try to get above that to reduce scintillation. Even develop these complex adaptive optic systems so the mirrors can warp in the same way the sky essentially does with the starlight coming in. Astrophysicists hate twinkling stars, but in indigenous cultures, twinkling stars are not a problem to be overcome. They're a very important tool in the observer's toolkit. And scintillation can tell you very important things about forecasting weather. I'm going to play a little video here. Hopefully we can all hear this. This is Uncle Alo Topham from Mare. He's a Mare elder. Alo Topham OAM. He got his OAM last year, which is fantastic in recognition of all of his important contributions. So I'm going to play this video just to show you a little bit about him talking about what scintillation means. I'm going to talk to you about how that links to light pollution.
There's various signs that season change. We see in trees and gardens, but mainly in the stars. It's become quite apparent towards the end of the year when you get the very clear sky. Hot days during the night because there's no clouds, and same throughout the night. And the stars are there. The stars are very clear, all colorful. And when they twinkle, it heralds whether there's going to be, whether wind will pick up. And fishermen sort of capitalize on that. It gives them their idea that they have to have a good day out at sea, or they can overnight at the reef, come back the next day by observing these stars. But especially from spring into summer, you get that dry, hot season where there's hardly any cloud up in the sky. There's, I don't know if you, I think the word doldrum, which is very fine, not a breath of air. The air is still, not in motion. During the night, where the dew sets in, you see that stars. The stars are, they're really outshining and they're twinkling. And it's a good sign. It tells that it heralds changes in the weather. Instead of that hot, dry season, there is a wet season coming through. And locals always look forward to that part of, they observe the stars because the gardener is anxious. When my plants are in, when is that rain going to come? And they observe stars, the plants, and the path of the sun. And at night, they are aware that there is a dew, even though there's a hot sun. The coolness of the dew goes right into the dry ground. Even though it may look brittle on top. But when a farmer digs down, it's cool and it's sort of muddy inside. And it's the result of the dew. Dew keeps the soil inside.
So what we see there is that the scintillation of stars is extremely important. In our book, The First Astronomers, we have an entire chapter dedicated to stellar scintillation. And what the elders talk about is you have to look at all the different properties of it. How fast are the stars scintillating? Are they changing color? How sharp are they? These are all important things for understanding not only the changing of seasons, but for forecasting weather. And that knowledge is combined with looking at the behavior of the animals. So there's a special kind of butterfly that has the same colors of the reggae flag. That's what the elder explained it. And he talks about how the male of that species will be out fluttering about. You're going to see those twinkling stars and you know a storm is coming. So you look at all these different characteristics together. What that means is you have to have an accurate way of reading stellar scintillation. And for astrophysicists, scintillation simply refers to the rapid changing of brightness. But really, when we're talking about it here with the elders, we're talking about what astronomers call your seeing conditions, how well you can see the stars. And that will include changes in their color, or their sharpness. And that's caused, of course, by turbulence in the atmosphere. Now, light pollution doesn't necessarily affect turbulence in the atmosphere, but what does affect the seeing conditions is pollutants, is dust and things like that kicked up, the increasing number of droughts, the huge mines that are being put in that destroy the landscape and kick up all this dust and debris into the sky, whether it's local or regional or even on a global scale, all that extra pollution that's hitting the sky that might not even be light pollution, but the other types of pollution are also impacting that. They're affecting those different seeing conditions and the people's ability to read the stars. So when we talk about light pollution and the importance of indigenous astronomy, it's not just the light itself, it's also the other activities that are happening, particularly in Australia and these colonized countries. So when we see all this, we know that before, 150 years ago, there really was no light pollution of any kind. You had these excellent dark skies everywhere. Light pollution itself is kind of a concept in some of the Aboriginal traditions, because it talks about, from Gunai Kurnai country in Gippsland, Victoria, about this relationship between the emu and the moon man, and how in the sky they're kind of rivals. And when the moon man comes out, the emu hides away until the moon man disappears again. Well, the moon is a source of light pollution, a natural source of light pollution, which is why astronomers don't like to, do telescopic observations around a full moon. The new moon's always the best time for that. But when that moon comes out, its light actually washes away the Milky Way. If the moon washes away the Milky Way, imagine what all of our bloody light pollution is doing. So we get these problems where you only really get these excellent dark skies in really, really rural areas. But even out there, it's being impacted. And as you go closer and closer to the cities, all those stars you see, all those stars of Tagai, all those stars of the Zugabulls and the emu in the sky, and the emu in the sky, that motif isn't even unique to Australia. You find the exact same thing in South America with the rhea in the sky. It's a large flightless bird, just like an emu. And there are different communities across Brazil and Argentina and those areas that have very similar traditions. You find these links all around the world, but that's being erased. It's being erased by increased urbanization. The natural resource extraction industry creates a lot of light pollution, as does physical pollution, which impacts the view of the sky itself. So if you've got cultures where the sky is the main anchor point, everything is reflected in the sky. If you want to know your social laws, they're written in the stars. If you want to know how to navigate, it's all written in the stars. If you want to know how to tell time, it's all written in the stars. If you want to know how to forecast weather, predict the behavior of the plants and animals, that's all written in the stars. And if you have somebody that just goes in and washes it all out, what is that? It's very deliberate. Maybe people don't think about that. Maybe government agencies and mining companies don't think about trying to wipe that out, but they're certainly not that concerned about it. And it's becoming a growing problem. And this chart here sort of gives you an idea. I'm not entirely sure about the limiting magnitude of that. I think most visual limiting magnitudes are around 6 to 7. I'd be surprised if many people can see 8. But the point being is it starts to show you how you go from those dark sky sites to a more urban site. It washes everything away to the point where when you're in a city, you can't even see the stars of the Southern Cross, except for 2 or 3 of them, maybe. It's becoming such a massive issue that it literally is erasing the sky. And when it erases the sky, you erase the culture. You erase people's relationship to it. I mean, how do we link to something we can't even see? Whether you're indigenous or not. We want to be able to see the stars. We get so much inspiration out of that. Whenever I ask fellow astronomers, what made you want to be an astronomer? Almost everybody says the same thing. They fell in love when they saw the stars for the first time. Maybe you grew up in a country area like I did in mid-Missouri, where I got a pretty good view of the stars. Maybe you're in a city and you went out to some, country area for the first time and you saw the stars and it inspired you. Seeing the stars and being able to connect with them is one thing that really inspires our connection to the stars and also inspires a generation of astronomers and astrophysicists. If we can't see it, how the hell can we connect to it? But it's also that gradual erasure of culture And that deeply impacts people's identity, their health, their well-being. We see the health effects of that. When you're no longer using the stars to garden and fish and hunt, you instead go to the grocery store is full of crap food, and it changes diets, it changes health, and it's for the negative. So the argument that I've been trying to make in here, and I hope I've been able to show you in the 50 minutes we've been doing this, is that the erasure of the sky, the light pollution and other forms of pollution, which are driven by urbanization, which itself is driven by colonization, is actively engaging in cultural genocide. And this is something that has to be stopped. It's something that I see myself. I live in Yarraville in the inner west of Melbourne, and there's a little park near where I love walking through. And I saw they were putting up new lighting fixtures. I saw them, putting up a flyer saying they're going to be putting those. And I'm just thinking, oh no, this is going to be bad. Because what they have are not ideal, but they're your sort of old-fashioned, sort of yellowy kind of lights, soft light. They put the new ones up, and I walked through at night. I was almost blinded walking at night. It's like mini suns of blue LEDs, a whole little matrix of them just blasting down. And it's like walking through the daylight when you're walking on the footpath. And you can't see much more than a few meters beyond that because there's a stark contrast between light and dark. And I contacted the council and asked them about that. And they finally got back to me and said, oh, it's about community desires and needs and whatnot. And they kind of just skirted around the whole idea that I'm not asking you to not light the area. We need to find those solutions, which people have been doing lots of. This whole organization is dedicated to that. It's using the right kinds of LED lights, using those amber, those cooler lights instead of the bright blue ones. I mean, we know how dangerous the bright blue ones are. That's why we have these blue light filters on our phone. It harms us, it harms wildlife, it harms the sky. It's about having it so the light isn't pointing up or reflecting off and scattering all around. It's about knowing you don't need to use so much light. You don't need one of these blasting solar, lights every 5 meters. You don't need that. But I stand on my balcony in Yarraville and I look out towards the west, which I love because I love sunsets and I have unparalleled, amazing views of the sunsets. When the sun goes down, the light pollution is just horrific. And that's looking away from the city. That's looking out towards the suburbs. It's devastating when I see that. So, the whole point of me trying to make this kind of argument and use something as harsh as saying this is cultural genocide is to really light a fire under people's asses, to realize that this is something really, really important. And that by not engaging this, we're not just doing something that's mildly inconvenient. You're destroying people, you're destroying cultures, and you're destroying lives. This is why dark skies are so important. On that note, if you want to learn more, go to aboriginalistronomy.com.au. In the next couple of months, I'll be building a new website to sort of clean some things up for this. You can find those papers that we talked about before that were written by Uncle Gillar and Bob Fuller and colleagues on there. You'll find information about the Australian National Curriculum on there, which we've written some of this content into that. Information about the book, The First Astronomers, will be coming out in a couple of months. It'll be on there. It won't come out until next year, but the information about it will come out. And I'm also excited to announce that we're going to be delivering a new subject here at the University of Melbourne on dark sky studies. It's going to be a third-year subject. It's going to be a breadth or gen ed subject. And that means it's going to be available to any student in the university. And what we're going to be doing there, we don't exactly know when it's going to take place, 2023. I'm hoping to make it a summer intensive course. It'll be 10 days of 3 hours a day of this, but there's going to be lectures on its impact with astronomy, its impact with ecology, its impact on human health, on crime, on economics, the solutions to how to fix this, looking at landscape architecture and design and some case studies. That's what we're all aiming for. So it's going to be very transdisciplinary. It's going to be very exciting, and I'm putting the paperwork together now to have that delivered, hopefully in January, February of 2023. So I'd like to thank you for sticking around and listening to me go on for a while. We're going to open it up now. I'm going to pass it back to Richard, and I'll be here available to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Duane. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that was a fascinating and impassioned presentation and touched on many of the reasons that we have the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance, that we started this charity, and are supported by many of you attending this webinar, and we thank you all for that. So I'd like to go ahead now and open the floor for questions. Please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will try to field those as best as we can. And I would also like to point out that we have some people attending from other countries with strong First Nations astronomy interests, and I'm sure all of these issues apply equally there. And for example, we had some comments there from Piripi Lambert in New Zealand, echoing many of the names and stories, and I'm sure feels these effects as well. This is really a global issue that you've touched on. So I will ask the first question, which is, I was just wondering if you had any perspective of the impacts on First Nations people that are living really within urban centers where this issue of light pollution is most extreme. Do you have any particular comments on that aspect?
Thanks, Richard. I've been speaking with elders about this sort of topic, and it comes up that there's a common belief that most Aboriginal people live out, remote country areas, but the largest concentration of Aboriginal people in Australia is Western Sydney. That there are actually more Aboriginal people living in the cities than there are in regional and remote areas. But the problem, as the elders talk about, is that from the cities, when you get tied in with everything happening, all the busy stuff and the endless screens we have blasting us in the face everywhere we go, the people are losing that connection to the stars. And you don't need the stars to navigate. You use your phone. You don't need the stars to know when to go hunt or fish or garden or farm or harvest. You just go to the grocery store. You don't need the stars to do so many of these things, but that's where it's becoming really negatively impactful. People are losing connection to culture. And even non-Indigenous people like myself, we love the stars, Richard, I know you do. We love the stars, Marnie. We love going out and seeing this. This is why we're doing what we do and why we love being astronomers. But we have to go drive hours. We have to drive 7 hours to Siding Springs to get an observatory, or remotely do it from some other part of the world because it's so bad. So we're losing our connection. Everybody's losing this connection. So this is what the elders are talking about, that the knowledge in many places in urban areas isn't being passed down to new generations to the same degree or amount or whatever that it used to be because of the effects of colonization. And that because of that, young people come into the cities because that's where the jobs are. That's where you're going to survive. You go to uni, you go to school. In the Torres Strait, for example, most of the islands only go up through maybe year 6. There's only, I think, 2 islands that have schools that go up to year 12, but most students go to the mainland. They live with the family, Cairns, Townsville, Darwin, Brisbane, Rockhampton, wherever. And there aren't really many economic benefits to going back to the islands. So usually when young people go and they go to the cities, they wind up staying there and not coming back home. And when you're not coming back home, you're not engaging with the elders who are teaching the language and the cultures and traditions. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all. I'm saying the elders are telling me that it doesn't happen nearly as much as it should. And there's this gradual decline in the amount of knowledge being passed down. And colleagues, Bon Mott referred this to me as slow violence. And it's this sort of chipping away at it bit by bit by bit, which is, it's one of the main modus operandi of colonization. It's this long-term game of just slowly eroding things away, this deliberate erasure. And that's one of the big problems that's happening. That's why when we're working with the communities, and even when we're doing these education programs, it's not just about learning about cultural astronomy and Indigenous astronomy. It's also, how do we help safeguard and protect that heritage through dark sky initiatives?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Okay, I have another question related to the impacts of light pollution. It's kind of maybe a new form of light pollution. So I guess we're familiar with the concept of light pollution associated with urban development, scattering in the sky and kind of making the stars harder to see. But are you noticing that more discussions around the impacts of artificial satellites sort of interfering with the night sky experience, even when you're away from cities and urban areas?
Yes, and this is a huge hot topic right now that is a very fiery hot topic. Gamilero astrophysicist and PhD candidate Carly Noon did an interview with, I think it was Vice magazine in the US about this very topic. Crystal DiNapoli has been doing some interviews about this. Pete Swanton is a Gamilero man who's now working on a Master of Philosophy degree at ANU. And he's looking at indigenous astronomy and light pollution. So you're getting a whole new generation of Aboriginal students in this space who are bringing these worlds together. And they're very much advocating against all these artificial satellites. Because we all know that there's this constant push for technological innovation, which is fine, and sort of advancement, but that comes at a cost. But there are ways of doing that that are less impactful and ways of doing that are more harmful. And the idea of having global internet seems wonderful, even though most of us are actually having to go see specialists and get off social media because we're so drawn to these things to such a degree. It's not necessarily positive. But they've been writing and speaking quite a bit about the problems of these artificial lights and seeing that as a colonization of space, both in a literal and I wouldn't say metaphorical sense, but colonizing your view of the stars and the actual colonization of moon and Mars and asteroids and things of that nature. So, if you want to learn more about those views and those opinions from the right people, I think in that regard, go look up the work of Carly Noon, Crystal DiNapoli, and Pete Swanton, and I think Kirsten Banks is doing some work in that area. They're all at that intersection of traditional knowledge of astrophysics and the importance of dark skies and the colonization of space.
Indeed, and we're lucky to have their advocacy, I think. Okay, I have another question here. As an academic, how do you suggest to best promote the cultural importance and stories of the night sky without appropriating Indigenous knowledge or speaking on behalf of Indigenous voices? And that question comes from, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Kalicia Singleton.
Well, this is the constant consultation with the elders and communities. So it's elevating their voices and their knowledges and doing so with their guidance and permission. So the book, for example, was written with them. They're recognized. All proceeds of the book go to charity. All the Australian proceeds of the book will go to a charity that's been set up for community programs and scholarships for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in astronomy. All the New Zealand Aotearoa proceeds will go towards the Society for Maori Astronomical Research and Traditions and other communities, because the book is global in scope. If we do get, for example, US publishers, there'll be different communities it goes to there. When I'm doing these talks, every single time I do anything with the elders, I get their permission to do this and share this knowledge. So again, this isn't me, when I'm doing this, speaking on their behalf, but just helping to elevate their voices. That's why I prefer whenever I get the opportunity, like I did with Uncle Aloe Topham, you hear directly from them. So there's a push to help, support and train and elevate the new generation of Aboriginal students who are walking in this world, between these two worlds, I should say. It's a term they use in Turtle Island, US and Canada, called the Waktamunk, and it's two-eyed seeing. And that's seeing with one eye from the Indigenous perspective and one eye from the perspective of Western science. So this generation of people coming into this space, of Indigenous people coming into this, can utilize that approach. And they're going to be able to accomplish far more than people like myself who can only speak from one side. I can't speak from the Indigenous side at all. So with regard to the subjects we're teaching, we get lots of guest lecturers who come in. We get Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Maori, US and Canadian First Nations, elders, shamans, knowledge holders, artists who come in and talk about different aspects of traditional star knowledge.
Thanks for that. And one more question here from Jim Wilmot. Great presentation. Are you concerned by the impact COVID may have had on light pollution with more people moving into regional areas coming out of the urban centers?
That's a really interesting question because it's causing a lot of economic turmoil at the moment. You know, it's so difficult for people to, you know, younger generations to afford to be able to buy, you know, housing. And now that there's this big expansion of people moving out into regional areas, what were areas where you could afford something are now becoming areas you can't afford. And yeah, with this sort of fleeing from the cities, you are going to get more urbanization in those areas. And I've been trying to do some work with landscape art. Well, I've been involved in a project with landscape architects at Monash University. And we're working at places like Warknabeel, which, if you have any idea what that is, it's a very small little town north of Horsham, whose claim to fame is that's where Nick Cave was born. They've got a big sign because that's about the only thing the town has. Sorry to anybody in Warknabeel. Coming from a town of 45 people myself, I understand that, you know, we often make fun of the places we grow up that are tiny like that. But yeah, there's this push in that regard. And one of the problems we've seen in regional areas is they're trying to be green, which is good. And they see LED lights as a solution to green energy, which it is in regard to the cost, you know, how much energy it actually uses, but it's not in regard to all the stuff we're talking about light and with regard to light pollution. And it's being exasperated not only because they're using LED lights, which are worse, the blue LED lights, which are worse, but because it's cheap, they're using more of them. And then these regional towns are actually, the light pollution is increasing just because of the transition from the older sources of light to the newer sources of light. If you just use the amber LEDs, that'll help immensely. And you don't need to use more of them. Like, we need darkness. We need that. But yeah, you're exactly right. I haven't thought too much about that. It's a really good point you're bringing up. And I'm gonna have to make a note of that so I can include a discussion of that in the new course we're gonna teach. But yeah, that is a very good point, because as the population spreads out, we bring that light pollution with us.
Indeed. I'm going to hand over to Marnie, who I think has a question as well.
Sorry, I've had to turn my video off because it was stalling the screen, and I was concerned seeing I'm hosting the event that I might collapse the whole thing. So apologies for that. But I wanted to ask you, Duane, particularly with all the interest in dark skies now, and obviously, you know, that's what I'm aware of. We're getting I'm getting very frequently questions about where can people learn about Indigenous astronomy? You know, I'm traveling out to this area. Can we find something like that to do at night? I'm getting questions from tourism boards asking, we'd like to have guides to do this. And you mentioned that there's an influx of First Nation people that come to the cities and get jobs there, but it'd be great to sort of draw them back out and use them for this. Just wondering what opportunities you know of, or maybe what opportunities we could create for that purpose.
That's a great question. And as I think many of us know, Australia has a huge tourism industry for astronomy, you know, especially in New South Wales. So there are a number of organizations who are incorporating Indigenous astronomy into tourism programs. Up in the Northern Territory, 10 years ago, I worked with an Indigenous-run organization in Kakadu to develop a night sky tour, which, after we developed that, they won first place in the Quantum Tourism Awards based on that tour. But then a few years later, it fizzled out. So I'm not sure what happened there, but you know, it is a growing problem. It's also a huge market. So I've got a couple of Aboriginal organizations who've approached me about working with them to help develop night sky tourism programs, getting some of the Aboriginal students and people involved in that, which is something that's really starting to take off because people are getting sick of it. We're getting sick of screens. I think, you know, I know it's ironic us doing this on Zoom, but we're all burnt out with Zoom. We're burnt out with staring at TVs and screens all day. Lockdown, I think, has had that profound effect where we've been blasted by so much of our screens that we just want to get away. We want to get out and reconnect with nature. And walking around Melbourne now, thousands of people all gathered in groups outside at parks, sitting in the grass, speaking to each other, and there's nobody on their phone. That's something that just before this latest lockdown had gone away. You don't see many people sitting outside. Everybody's walking around like drones on their phones. So I think that, COVID in a weird way can have detrimental effects in that. I think maybe one of the positive effects is that it's really encouraged people to get away from the cities. And as people get away from the cities, they're seeing the stars and they're reconnecting with that. They're getting really excited about that. And as we always said, Bush TV was stars in the campfire. You just go back and forth between the two. Channel 1, Channel 2. That's one of those things that we're working with some different communities on. But there's a huge demand for it, a rapidly growing demand, as Marty, you pointed out already, which means there's a huge scope to do more of that. And yeah, I think if anybody has, the expertise and the time and inclination, that's a great place to do. And it's Aboriginal students like the ones that are working in our groups, and First Nation students and communities and people around the world who could be going out and developing these tourism programs that bring these worlds together. So it needs to happen, absolutely.
Thanks, Duane.
We still have some more questions to get through, Duane. I hope that's okay. We've had one from Barbara Rook, who I think echoes very strongly your frustration with the upgraded lighting that seems to be prolific in our councils and districts, and shares the same experience of really badly designed, very white lighting put in without much or any consultation with the local residents. So in your interaction with that, would you have any advice or any positive reflections on your interactions with local authorities when it comes to unwanted lighting installation?
Wow, I've hit a bit of a brick wall with that. I think there are ways of doing it, and the ways we have to do it are education campaigns, making it big stuff, getting it out there. Having little talks here and there is nice, but we need to, that all contributes to this snowballing effect of awareness. When it comes to councils, it can be a nightmare because they think they know best. Even if they don't have any clue about certain things, it perpetuates these stereotypes of more light means less crime, when the actual studies have shown that's not the case at all. In fact, in some cases, it actually increases crime. These use of LED lights aren't helping to save people. People aren't safer because with these dull lights, if I'm standing on a sidewalk or footpath and there's a light above me, but it's that dull, cooler light, I can still see somebody who's 20 meters away. Not clearly, but I can still see them a bit. With these new lights that are so freaking bright, somebody 2 meters away, I can't hardly see. Like, that contrast is so sharp there. When I try getting this across, it's just like, oh, we've already done that. We don't care. There's probably somebody behind a computer rolling their eyes thinking, oh God, somebody's always going to complain about something. But yeah, I am complaining about it for good reason. So I think that if we can get people in the councils who make the decisions involved in these programs, if we target them, targeting sounds like a bad term to use, but if we aim at trying to bring them in and understand what's happening, then that's going to have an impact. We're going to make far more ground by getting those people in, getting the policy makers, the policy designers, the decision makers in these audiences is going to be a lot more impactful than getting everybody else involved who can yell and scream at councils who are just going to say, we don't care. So, I don't know how that sounds, but that's kind of been my experience and my ongoing experience right now, because I just got a response from the council fairly recently about that. And the impression was that we'll take that on board. It's going to go in the bin, and we've already done it. There's no changing that now. Now, when I walk through the park, I won't say what I want to do. I don't want those lights there anymore. It drives me nuts.
If I could add to that, Duane, I think the other thing that compounds this is that the council often doesn't have much choice. Often it's a pre-made decision. The lights are being pre-purchased. Even at Siding Spring, Coonabarabran's recently gone through a lighting upgrade, and whilst they approached Siding Spring Observatory about the lights that were implemented, in the end, it was all pre-chosen. We just basically, you know, we had little other than to say, could you make them a bit warmer, which they did do. But that is an exception. That is an area of New South Wales that has a state guideline that's so. I find that the councils often have not even been consulted about what lights are going through their streets. So it's a multi-prong issue, definitely something that comes across ADSA's radar frequently, and something that we hope that we can have a little bit of impact through, as you said, you know, that constantly talking to councils, you know, if they didn't know about art, you know, that they've probably been told that they're being given good lights. So, you know, it's all education.
Too much cream on councils. I do apologize. I shouldn't put too much of that on them, because like I said, the policymakers, as you pointed out, aren't always in the council.
Yeah, no, I think it's multi-pronged problem, basically. Mm.
Indeed.
I see a couple people in the comments. There's one, Steve from Taunawong Country. Taunawong is one of the communities who approached me about doing some astronomy tours up there. So hopefully we can get something going in the next year or two. It'd be great.
Indeed. Okay, so one last question, coming back to your talk, Duane. Do you find that that the younger generation of Indigenous people are as concerned about the effects of light pollution as elders? Is this an equally held feeling, or is there some disparity?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm in a very biased position, because most of the Aboriginal students I know are working in this space. Of course, they're very, very passionate about it. And when I'm in the communities working with the elders, I'm learning from the elders who are passionate about that. So I think I'm getting the one end of the spectrum on this. I do think that there's obviously a major push now for, you know, recognition and giving back and reclaiming lands and culture. And, you know, there's a big pushback against the ongoing effects of colonization, which absolutely needs to happen. I'm not going to pretend that I can speak on behalf, you know, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but there's obviously a humongous social movement pushing for that. And I think it's great, you know, having these programs, having university subjects with elders coming in as guest lecturers is going to fire the students up. Getting students who, you know, might come from the city, that maybe they're not Indigenous students, they're going to learn to appreciate the depth and complexity of this knowledge. And with you know, breadth and gen ed courses like this, subjects, they're going to come in and add this into their studies and degree programs. They're going out and spreading this, and, you know, in their work and careers and jobs. And, you know, something like a dark sky studies course would be great, because we get people from all different areas. You know, we'll get people who are concerned about the ecological effects who don't know anything about the astronomy. Maybe people about, you know, from the lighting design side who might not know a lot about the astronomy and ecological side of view, but they're going to learn about that. So I think all these different campaigns that are happening, and what you're doing here is fantastic. You're getting, you know, hundreds of people coming to these talks and stuff. You're spreading those seeds, and that's going to have a huge impact. But it's like a snowball effect. We just got to keep that rolling to get bigger and bigger over time.
Great. Well, I think we will end the question and answer there. So thank you so much for your time, Duane, and your insightful answers. And thanks so much to the audience for being so engaged and giving some great questions and sharing your thoughts with us through the chat. And it's all very insightful stuff. And I think Duane may even have some new research projects after the talk to explore with the COVID effects and so on. So very fruitful presentation. So I would just like to come to this final segment and advertise that next month we'll be having not so much a webinar as a question and answer session relating to an initiative that ADSA is running, which is really, we call it the Youth Ambassador Program. And so, you know, as you probably gathered, light pollution is a very complex and multifaceted issue. There's lots of different aspects to it. None of them are necessarily well connected, which is why ADSA is trying to make those connections and make it fully understood what the costs and impacts are of poor lighting practices. Key to that effort is engaging young people, and they bring energy and creativity to this issue that is really inspiring. And we try to support this through our Youth Ambassador program. And so we've been fortunate to have a couple of talented young people. This is a program that's targeted at 18 to 25-year-olds who have come on board with us and have obtained mentoring from the ADSA board, upskilling in science communication, and generating their new initiative, their own new initiatives that they would like to see enacted in this space. So on the 18th of November, in a month's time, we'll be having a question and answer session for anyone who's interested or knows somebody who might be interested in participating in this program and sending us an application. That will be a great opportunity to ask questions, find out what it's all about, and see what our ambassadors have been up to using their time. And I'm going to ask my colleague Marnie to, hopefully I've summarized that well, Marnie, or you can add if you would like.
No, you've done that perfectly. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, great. So I do encourage you to jump online with us in a month's time for that question and answer session. And we'll be sending stuff out around the usual channels nearer the time. And then finally, we would like to share with you a special video that was commissioned by ADSA. It's a wonderful movie that I think will resonate with the ideas and that connection to the night sky that so many of us on this webinar have. So hopefully the technology works and Marnie can share her screen and her sound. It's not a very long video, it's a few minutes or so, and that will bring our webinar to a close. So Marnie, I'll ask you to share your screen and we'll see if we can get this going.
Darkness. It gets a bad rap. For many people, darkness represents fear, the unknown, the unseen. But for other people, darkness is beautiful. Darkness is the place to dream. Darkness is the uncluttered space where you can allow your imagination to fly. First Nations people understood the heavens. They knew about the stars. Stars allowed them to determine the seasons, to understand their world and to navigate. Astronomers need darkness to peer out into the huge void of space and to push the limits of scientific possibility. Too much artificial light is threatening darkness all across the planet. Light pollution is the fastest growing pollutant on Earth, and it's growing every year. Light pollution threatens all the creatures on Earth who need darkness, including humans, animals and plants that rely on darkness to find their food and locate the right things to eat, to sleep properly, to migrate and to reproduce. One very important small navigator in our region is the bogong moth, which needs darkness to cross Australia and to arrive every year in vast numbers in the Australian Alps in spring, where it becomes a critical food source for the tiny mountain pygmy possum just waking up from its winter hibernation beneath the snow.
Mountain pygmy possums are one of Australia's most amazing, unique and critically endangered species. They're our only mammal found exclusively in the alpine zone and Australia's only hibernating marsupial, spending 5 to 7 months asleep under the snow every year. Their main food source is the migratory bogong moth. Around 4.4 billion moths are estimated to arrive every year. They fly often over 1,000 kilometres to arrive up in the alpine zone. It's the second largest influx of nutrients into the area after the sun, making them extremely important for mountain pygmy possums and other species that rely on them. We don't know exactly why the bogong moths didn't arrive in those numbers in 2017 and 2018, and again in quite low numbers in 2019. But we believe it's a combination of factors, including light pollution. We believe that moths are attracted to this light from their huge migrations, and they're trapped.
Here in northeast Victoria and across the border region, we're lucky we can enjoy beautiful night skies. With their high altitudes, the clear air, no urban pollution, but we can lose them very, very easily, and we need to protect them.
On the border region and in northeast Victoria, we have an enormous opportunity to capture the beautiful skies that we already enjoy. Lonely Planet has just released a guidebook which tells people about the best places in the world to enjoy the dark night sky, and recognising a growing market of people who want to enjoy all of nature, including the night skies and the darkness. But even here, light pollution is a growing threat. There are lots of ways to reduce light pollution. There are some very effective planning guidelines that were originally developed by New South Wales Planning to protect the dark skies around the Siding Springs Observatory near Coonabarabran. These are very effective at reducing light pollution and ensuring that the dark skies remain for future generations to enjoy. Dark sky regulations and light planning regulations are not about making people live in gloom. They're about ensuring that only the amount of light that is required for the task at hand is used, and that there is no light spill sideways or upwards into the sky that potentially could destroy darkness for all of us forever. These dark sky regulations are being adopted voluntarily by many progressive local governments all around Australia, including in New South Wales, Western Australia, and Queensland. Local government is critically important for taking action to help protect dark skies, but we all have a role to play.
So wherever possible, please turn off those unnecessary outdoor lights. Help beautiful animals like the mountain pygmy possum and the bogong moth. Help animals like our frogs and our owls and our bats, species that we should be seeing in the beautiful night sky away from light.
Darkness is critically important. Darkness is something that we all need to protect, and we must protect it actively. But before we do anything, let's just take out time tonight, and the first thing is to walk outside and look up at the night sky and drink in that beautiful, peaceful, uncluttered darkness. And remember that this is something that we share with all life on Earth.
And with those wise words, I'll encourage you all to go and enjoy the night sky, and hopefully see you at the next webinar. Thank you again, Duane, and thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Duane.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.